Welcome to the 2021 Hugh Kay Memorial Lecture. Hugh Kay was a very distinguished broadcaster and journalist and one of the founding spirits of the Institute of Business Ethics. And this annual lecture was instituted in 1990 as a memorial to his contribution and to provide a platform for topical debate on issues relating to business and ethics and society. And during the course of the last 30 plus years, we've been privileged to hear from a number of very distinguished speakers, including Sir Mark Moody-Stewart and Sir Tim Melville-Ross. And of course, last year's lecture was given by Lord Evans of Weardale, Jonathan Evans, the chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. And his Hugh Kay Memorial Lecture 2020 remains highly topical today, with all of the news about standards in public life, debates in Parliament, about the conduct of MPs and ministers and so on. And I am sure that this year's Hugh Kay Memorial Lecture will be no less enlightening and provocative and will leave us with lots to go away and think about. This lecture will be recorded. It will be available from tomorrow on the Institute of Business Ethics website and also on YouTube. And without more ado, I am delighted to welcome this year's lecturer, Irene Dorner. Irene has had a very successful business career. She is a qualified barrister. She worked with HSBC for more than 30 years, including in Malaysia and in the United States of America, where she was ultimately the president of HSBC in the USA. And during her tenure, she was voted by American Banker as the most powerful woman in American banking. She's a former chair of Virgin Money and today is chair both of Wimpey and of Control Risks. She is an honorary fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford, and her topic of diversity is just a ticket to the game. The goal is inclusion, could not be more topical. Irene, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. I have to say that after a list of people who have previously lectured here before, I am stunned that you want to have me, David, but I am delighted to be here. I'd like to start by saying that while my comments today are business and corporate focused, much of what I want to cover is relevant in all walks of life, and anyone who's been following the cricket debacle this week will know that that is the case. I'd like to start by saying that diversity and inclusion has moved on. It's no longer enough to be an advocate and an ambassador, and I've been wheeled out on many an occasion at many events to be just that. It's no longer enough to have one of everything in the room, and in fact, having only one, for example, one woman director is not a good idea because they get extremely lonely, extremely isolated, and you need more than one. So if that's not enough, what should our aim be? And I would say that our aim should be inclusion. And by that, I mean the creation of an environment where everyone is safe to be who they are, to contribute as themselves, and to be part of the fabric of the endeavor that they've chosen to join. Now, ultimately, you could say this is about equality. And if we can't agree that philosophically it's the right thing to do, then whenever I get stumped on that, I explain that it is commercially the right thing to do. There's plenty of evidence that shows that companies that ascribe and deliver on diversity and inclusion also deliver better results. But I would also add that it is the responsibility of both sides, both the individual employee, because I actually firmly believe that it is a sin not to realize your full potential. But I equally think that it is the responsibility of the employer and the leaders of the employer who have to create an environment where that can occur. I'd also like to say something this evening about data, because the data makes it clear that inclusion leads to engagement and engagement leads to productivity. And if that's the case, then why do we find this so hard? If that is the hard-nosed business case, why do we find this so hard? I'd also like to say something about where I think we're up to and possibly what the barriers are of stopping us getting much further at the moment. And in case I've just dispirited everybody and you've all just switched off, I'd also like to talk a little bit about what, in my opinion, works. And at the end of the day, why this is so critically important to all of us. So, diversity and inclusion, the thinking has definitely moved on. I had my aha moment on this sitting on a train to Derby. I had been invited by the Rolls-Royce Pride movement, their LGBT employee resource group, for a lunchtime chat. They're good friends of mine, and I was sitting on the train and I thought I was going to have an easy train ride, and I thought they were going to wheel me out to do the usual. And I thought, well, I better just check really. So I called Greg, who runs the whole group, and said, Greg, what do you particularly want to cover today? Have we got a particular agenda? And he said, yes, we do. What I want you to talk about is what works. I want some active advice and tips on how to create inclusion within the teams on a day-to-day basis. Well, panic. I'd never been asked to comment on that before. I'd always been the person who broadcast the message. And listen, there is nothing wrong with advocacy and nothing wrong with being an ambassador. I'm an ally of the LGBT movement, particularly the LGBT movements. I have advocated the creation of employee resource groups in all businesses that I've been present in, across the piece of diversity, not just LGBT. I've advocated mentoring, reverse mentoring, speaking up. But day to day, how do you crack it? Well, the journey rumbled on, and I realized that, calling upon some of the experiences I'd had in the United States, this is the cri de coeur from colleagues of the global majority. You don't know who I am. And I realized that the key here is that you need to get to know each individual employee. Yes, you'll make some mistakes. Yes, it's scary. Yes, you're going to ask some wrong questions. And yes, this is a burden on our already overburdened managers. And I was reminded as we chugged along that once in the United States, in an opinion poll in the bank that I was running at the time, not an opinion poll, I'm sorry, an employee focus survey, only a very tiny percentage of our employees identified themselves as LGBT. This is in New York City. So we'd either scared them away, or they didn't want to tell us, or something had gone wrong with the survey. So I went to the LGBT group to investigate. And I was told a sad story by one young man who, as part of a bad year of bonuses and redundancies, had been told by his boss, well, it's all right for you, you're single. I've got people here with mortgages and kids. And so, you know, you just consider yourself lucky you've got a job. The fact you haven't got a bonus is, you know, neither here nor there. He had never bothered to find out that that young man was gay and was married, and that his husband had just been made redundant the day before. So if you don't know your people, you are in danger of creating unintended harm that lasts, unfortunately. Now, strangely enough, that was not my aha moment. That was my terrified moment of trying to find something to talk about over lunch. My aha moment was simply this. When we ask our people to do that within the corporate environment, we are actually asking them to do something more than they would socially. We're asking them to go outside of their comfort zone. So I ask you, how diverse is your social group? How diverse are you socially? I would suggest that we gravitate to our own comfort zones, and we tend to mix with people like us. I happen to be comfortable in the LGBT space because I have a high proportion of gay friends historically, but I have stood up in US Black History Month when the speaker was late, one rather cold night in New York, and I was asked if I could hold the fort for a few minutes while she turned up in a taxi. So I stood up, I was only supposed to introduce her, and I was the only white face in the room, and it took my breath away. I was staring at 150 black faces, none of whom were well represented on my management team or at all. And I actually had to say to them, for the first time ever, I know how you feel. So That's my aha moment. And the real aha is to be inclusive requires dramatically different and quite deliberate behavior. It is no longer good enough simply to advocate. And incidentally, my thinking was pushed on again by Control Risks, a little company that I chair, because they were considering their own diversity and inclusion groups, really, and how they fronted up to the world. And they were particularly challenged because their clients kept asking them, how do we do it? How do we manage the risk within our own business? And how do we create the right environment? So they had to look at themselves. They decided that diversity and inclusion, i.e. D&I, the acronym, was not enough. They needed to get equality in there. And the only counsel that I as chair was able to give them was to make sure they said DEI and not DIE, which would have had a totally different meaning. And they went on within a very short period of time to actually give advice to their clients when they're talking about safety and security whilst traveling on business. They actually gave advice to the gay community because they gave advice to gay men, particularly who are traveling, what to do and what not to do if you decide to investigate the gay life, the gay scene in a city that you're visiting. So equality also forms part of my thinking. And so incidentally, since I mentioned data earlier, so does data. I'm not going to regale you with all of the numbers, but diversity and inclusion definitely brings better decision-making, less groupthink. And I'm sure that I can go on the internet now and prove it to you with statistics in terms of shares, prices, and profits. Data shows that employees who feel included, safe, and able to contribute at work are far more engaged. And engagement is the aim both for a healthy community and for productivity. So if the data's clear, why is this so hard? And I again come back to because it requires us to change our behavior. Having said that, I sometimes think that in order to find out where you are, you need to look back a little bit. And in needing to look back, I'm going to give you a very simplistic view of what I think about where we've come from. My simplistic view is, as an ex-lawyer, is I can point to all sorts of bits of legislation, even in the 1800s, like the Married Women Property Act, where things did move forward, improvements were made, people getting the vote, women getting the vote, and so on. But really, until the 1960s, not much was focused on actual discrimination. And in the 1960s, after much lobbying, debate, and campaigning, a full suite of anti-discrimination legislation was put forward. And of course, what happened was we ended up with penalties for non-compliance. In fact, if you stuck a microphone under somebody's nose and said, "Are you racist?" immediately people got the drift. They were supposed to say no. Now, the idea is, once you do something like that, is you've drawn a line in the sand and it's a negative line. People are not supposed to cross it. But the hope is that it will trickle down, that it will change the way that we behave, and it will change it for the better. And inevitably, there are stops and starts. Inevitably, backlashes such as there's too much political correctness about. But you will have seen that, in fact, this is where the corporate manuals come from. They come from drawing lines in the sand. This is the behavior that we will not tolerate. At no point does anybody describe the behavior that we actually want. And I recall in the 1990s, I was the chief operating officer on a trading floor in London. And I dealt with what was then my first, but sadly not my last, sexual harassment case. And in a trading floor environment, which is a fairly robust environment, in a trading floor environment, within a matter of days, we discovered that the perpetrator and the victim had both gone sick with stress. We couldn't get hold of them. The company was sued by both sides, by both the perpetrator and the victim. And I ended up, I remember, quite vividly saying, not in defense of the trading floor, nor of the behavior that had occurred, but I do remember saying, there are two different cultures, and I would not dream of mixing a trading floor with a retail bank or a retail bank with a trading floor. Indeed, we discovered that when we tried to send some of our traders onto courses where retail bankers were, and their behaviors were completely different. So I wouldn't say I defended it, but I certainly didn't stamp on it. I said that in our environment, you could almost expect it to happen. Fast forward to 2017 and Me Too. I suspect that instead of creating the trickle-down feature that I described earlier from negative legislation, what we've actually done is developed a sort of a cosmopolitan elite philosophy, because it sounds right and because it's a good liberal thing to say. By advocating it, by writing it down in manuals, by having legislation, we think it's happened. However, that in itself is not a very inclusive way of behaving, because I think we probably have not taken everyone along. We have not taken account of other views. If we had, or if we had managed to change the world by advocating and by writing the right to legislation, we wouldn't have had Harvey Weinstein, we wouldn't have had Me Too, we wouldn't have what is allegedly in the press an epidemic of harassment in schools. We wouldn't have had our footballers in the Euro finals being castigated on social media. We wouldn't even have had Epstein possibly still reverberating through our financial system now. And as I started writing this, or not writing a speech, but putting down some notes at the weekend, I was listening to the shenanigans at Yorkshire Cricket. By the time we got to the end of the day, it was Essex. And by the time I got to doing this today, it's everywhere. And I suspect it will go into other sporting arenas as well. So have we changed? Well, yes, we have made progress, because we have changed boardrooms with the 30% Club. Now, of course, we should be focusing on the pipeline of women coming through organisations. We've had demonstrations, Black Lives Matter, but you've got the backlash about taking the knee. We still have, I'm very pleased to say, although I'm probably going to get beaten up by other board members for saying this, we still have people like Legal and General Investment Management strongly advocating change in boardrooms. They, 15 years ago, were very much smiled at, probably indulgently, for insisting that there needed to be more women in boardrooms. I received a letter from them just at the beginning of this year saying that if Taylor Wimpey did not have somebody of ethnic background on the board by the end of this year, then they would vote against me as the chair at next year's AGM. Do I think that's reasonable? No, I don't. On the other hand, I think that people are getting very frustrated about the lack of change. So I also ought to say at this point that I do believe that things that we have hard won in the past, that have taken a lot of time and effort and a lot of blood, sweat and tears to win, are very, very easily lost. And we need to be extremely careful. We don't bank things that we don't think they're in our back pocket and it's done. If you look at the way that they're changing the voting geographies in the United States, I think it's evidence that people are not watching out for other people's interests. So what do I think? I think that we've got top line successes, but below the surface, we are not moving fast enough. We're simply not moving the dial. And there is actually a strong chance that we have created a non-inclusion of people who don't agree with the top line. We're looking, again, for true behavioural change. So if that's what we're looking for, why don't we get it? I think I've already mentioned that we are asking a lot of everyone. As a matter of fact, we're asking people to get out of their comfort zone, and we're asking people to behave differently. It's a bit like the climate change argument. It's no good now just to talk about headlines. Action is required. We've got all the corporate manuals. We've got all the talk about culture being developed. But I suspect, and I'm hoping that, that this is something that people will recognise, having honest conversations within the corporate environment can actually be quite difficult. Anyone who thinks about the performance appraisal system in most organisations will be shaking their heads probably now if I could see you all, because actually the feedback mechanisms through organisations are generally speaking not very strong. Hence, when you come to a falling out with an employee, guess what? There is very little on file that actually says anything very honest about the individual or helps them change or develop. I also think at the moment, and this is probably my biggest concern, that singling out of speciality groups, and therefore anyone with the loudest voice, is actually not very helpful. I actually believe that diversity groups should help each other. There is safety in numbers, and there is also strength in numbers. Sometimes in the past, in my corporate life, I have found it necessary to give a lift, to give a boost to a particular diversity group, simply to try to get a bit of pace into the leveling of the playing field. And also because a rising tide floats all ships. What do I mean by that? Well, if you can get the women's groups moving, and that is an enormous number of just sheer people within the organization, it attracts the attention of LGBT, which in turn attracts the attention of the Black community or the Asian community, and people actually start to feel that they can speak up. So I'm all for giving people a hand, but I'm not for singling out speciality groups. Incidentally, all employee resource groups, when you sit down and take the time to ask them what they believe is a barrier to their own success, they all tell you exactly the same things. I can't see anybody who looks like me, so I don't know how to work my way through the system, and therefore I don't know what training I need. I don't even know if I'm welcome, and guess what? Nobody really knows who I am, and nobody really understands me. So sadly, and this I think is extremely sad, recent developments in terms of being woke, the cancel culture, no one to be upset on university campuses, nobody is allowed to say what they really think or feel, subject to the normal rules of engagement, I have to say. There is confusion, and there is also fear. And at the same time as looking at the FT last weekend, there was anyone who saw it would have seen the very sad story of Kathleen Stock, the professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex, herself gay, accused of transphobia. I'm not making a comment on what she said. I am simply distressed that there can be no debate, that she is not allowed to express a view. And I know that there are various other academics on campuses all around the world in a similar situation. So what's wrong with this? Well, what's wrong with it is no debate equals no progress, equals he who shouts loudest, etc., equals collateral damage, equals nobody speaking up, and actually it will drive another form of lack of inclusivity. And I asked myself, is this another stalling moment, or are we at some kind of pivotal point, either negative or positive? And I paused when I got to that point, because I'm thinking to myself, well, if we leave it as it is, what's the impact? If we don't take any action at all, what's the impact? What's the impact of where we are? The impact is we don't have collaboration. We don't have free exchange of views. We lack productivity and we lack transparency. I was reminded, and I'll go back to it now, whilst I was putting down some notes about Me Too in 2017, after the Harvey Weinstein debacle. Solving these problems is not simple. It should not be underestimated. Just after Me Too was formed, I was asked by an ex-colleague in New York if I was prepared to give an interview to the New York Times. And basically what they were saying was, nobody in finance has spoken up to say that this kind of harassment, this kind of toxic behavior occurs in finance. And we think it's because everybody's too scared and it's a regulated industry and people think that they're going to lose their jobs. I won't bore you with what my answer was, but it did make me think. In my career, I have been an employee and I have been physically and verbally harassed. I've worked for a boss who was a harasser himself. I have worked for people who condoned it and turned the other eye, looked the other way. I've worked for bosses who rooted it out under all circumstances and were totally intolerant. And then when I was a boss, what did I find? Well, some of the businesses I ran were fine and very well intentioned. But I've also inherited businesses where the environment was pretty toxic. I've sacked people for bad behavior. I've been sued by victims for allowing an environment, and I've been sued by perpetrators for allowing an environment where this kind of behavior can occur. So I have to say, I've pretty much seen it from every side, and it is very, very hard to deal with. I had hoped that the newer industries, and I used to stand on platforms saying, this diversity problem is something that is stuck in the old smokestack companies and banking and accountancy. And I used to sort of fly the banner and say, the new industries will get this done, they'll be better. So Facebook, Tesla, Uber, I'm not going to say anymore, but I don't really think that they are any better at all. Now, before everybody really does leave this call, including myself, I do think there are things that work. I think that what works is getting under the bonnet of what is going on. Yes, you have to have the manuals. Yes, the employee resource group's important. Yes, mentoring and reverse mentoring is equally important. Lots of training on unconscious bias, yes. But fundamentally, this should be about showing and not telling. What we really need is help and education to show people the behaviors that work. It is a scary place to be a manager and a leader at the moment with all of these barriers, these fear barriers flying around. We need to help them understand the best way to behave. And given the current environment, that is going to take quite a bit of courage. I was extremely cheered by Taylor Wimpey's efforts. I can only speak as I find. I was extremely cheered simply because in the building industry, you would imagine it's rather a sort of a rough and tough industry. And actually, maybe they were a bit late to diversity and inclusion, although they're doing pretty well now. They have leapfrogged. They have leapfrogged into this is all about behavior. Let's talk about it and let's work out what behavior works. I also think that it is incumbent upon all of us to ask ourselves if we are in fact part of the problem. And I certainly have been over the years. In 1976, when I first emerged from university, I actually, to the extent I thought about it at all, thought that in my chosen profession, which was law at the time, I thought that this was going to be a bit like a tsunami, that because of the sheer weight of numbers of women, that actually it would be 50-50 and it was just a question of time. Of course, that didn't happen. And what actually happened, I think, and I can tell you that a lot of senior women friends of mine will probably tell you the same thing. What actually happened was this. Those of us who were not bent out of shape by the banter, by the backdrop of negativity directed from all male environments towards females, and incidentally, I have said this many times, if it had been the other way around, it had been all women, it would have been directed in the opposite direction towards men because large blocks of same people tend to behave the same way. But why are there so few women at the top? Because we are the ones who did not take offense, who were not bent out of shape. We were either born like this, we were quick learners, but for whatever reason, it has not caused us to leave. But along the way, in the same way as droves of young Asian cricketers have left and left and left until you get to the top level and there are very few there, the same thing has happened in business. People don't tell you why they go, they simply leave because they can no longer deal with the environment. So what does that say about me? Well, it means I'm not actually that great a role model because you've got to be like me to survive and be where I am. I also think that you sort of become part of the problem. I remember when I was running marketing at HSBC, it took a very junior member of staff to come in and tell me that a particular run of adverts was sexist. And when I said, well, I don't think it is, what's the problem? It's a sort of an upmarket product, so what's the problem? And they said, well, there's only one female face in the whole thing. And when I thought about it, they were right. And it was most unfortunate because that female person was a lap dancer as well. So you can yourself, unfortunately, become part of the problem. And it wasn't until I was probably 50 that I realized that I had spent my time climbing up the slippery slope and that I needed to help poor people behind me and to be a voice for diversity and inclusion. You can tell from what I'm saying that I have recently felt very buffeted by the waves of woke, by the waves of cancel, by the waves of what's just and what's not just, and by the waves of just one after another, more of this coming through the press, in sport, in government, and so on. But I am not in any way giving up. This is fundamentally about sustainability, sustainability of our institutions and our corporations. Failure is not an option. In many ways, the old order is being challenged. In some ways, that's good, and in some ways, it's bad. But change does not come correctly without debate, without a free exchange of views, and without tolerance for what other people are saying. It's not easy because this is about changing behavior. Comfort zones are by definition comfortable, and I'm still of the opinion that a pound made the wrong way is ultimately a bad pound in the long run. I do think that inclusion is the foundation of greater understanding and tolerance, both of which are in short supply at the moment, and they underpin constructive debate. And without constructive debate, we will not be able to change the other parts of our society that we need to change. It brings you into the realm of sustainability, which will require all of us to give all of our ingenuity all of the time. But if some of us feel unable to express views, are fearful, unwelcome, we will again leave people behind and arguably create another form of non-inclusivity. Probably the reverse of what we've got today. And so progress across so many fronts depends upon us not faltering, depends on this being a pivotal moment for success and not failure. And I hope that you will join me in discussing this in a relevant and tolerant way. David, thank you very much.
Irene, thank you enormously. There was so much richness in that lecture, lots of insights from your own distinguished career, and lots to make us all really think very carefully about, do we stick too much in our own comfort zones, socially and professionally, and so on. As a professor of corporate responsibility in a school of management, I also have to say I thoroughly agree with you about some of the real risks today of a cancel culture and an unwillingness, particularly in higher education, to be able to have an informed and civilized debate. I think that's the absolute bedrock that we have to defend. Now, as we said in the chat at the beginning of this lecture, if you're watching this live, then we are tweeting with the hashtag Business Ethics Matter, all one hashtag phrase. So please, if you are a tweeter, do tweet your comments, your reactions to what Irene has said. And we do now have time for some debate and questions. So if you can please post those in the Q&A, please, and not in the chat room function. That will enable us to be able to track the questions. And just whilst we're waiting for colleagues to start to pose some questions, Irene, I was very struck by your comments about the dangers of us creating a new form of exclusion if we don't accept that people will have different points of view and that we should be able to have an informed debate. And this tendency for a so-called cancel culture and to look to exclude views that we don't feel comfortable with. I'd be very interested if we could tease out a little bit more. How, particularly in a business environment, do you tackle that head on so that on the one hand, you don't have young staff, the millennials, and very soon the Gen Z or the Gen Z saying, oh my goodness, these are folk who are just, they're just paying lip service to diversity inclusion. They're not really serious about our concerns. They don't really know who we are. And on the other hand, maybe, and in danger, of course, of oversimplifying massively. But on the other hand, older members of staff who say, but how do we deal with these questions? We need to have open debate about it rather than assuming that there is a clear answer.
Do you know, I was dreading you asking me that question, because I honestly, I think it comes down to this. And I am quite worried about exactly what you said, because if we have swathes of people coming from school, if half of what you read in the press is to be believed, there is, for example, a tolerance of particular behavior of harassment in schools, which will transfer straight into the workplace as being normal. I don't know what you do with that, because I have always assumed that that was wrong. And I have always assumed it was the responsibility of me as a leader to make sure that that environment did not persist. If, however, you end up, and I have no idea whether this is true or not, but a proportion of people who come into the organization believing that that's okay behavior, then you've got an inbuilt problem before you start. That is the reverse of what you were talking about, as a matter of fact, because I'm not sure how people can advocate diversity inclusion and advocate rights for individuals if, in fact, that kind of behavior is still creeping in. I just don't know how you do it. I think there's a toxic environment already in existence. I think that the answer, my straightforward answer, what I have seen work, is that you mix groups, that you simply force the issue, that you force the conversations to take place, and you force the interaction. If you don't force the interaction, nobody learns. But I actually think, and this is what I think needs some big thinking, there are ways of doing that safely and in a facilitated manner. There's no point shoving people in a room and saying, okay, now get on with it. You actually have to facilitate this. And it is a totally, totally different way of thinking and training. It is not to do with read this and tell me the answer. It is to do with showing.
Thank you very much. And that probably also argues for some structured reverse mentoring and two-way mentoring that you hinted at earlier. Now, so Mark Moody-Stewart, one of our previous Hugh Kay Memorial lecturers, says, excellent talk, Irene, and absolutely right. If we're trying all the actions that you suggest, asks Mark, how do you check if you're actually making progress? Because changes in numbers is slow. Work
is pulse surveys. Once a year, annual employee focus surveys are helpful, but they only happen once a year. So you pulse survey your organization in a subjective manner, not just counting heads and counting people. And you make sure that all results are communicated and that actions flow from those pulse surveys. The worst thing you can do is promise, not measure, and then not take action. And so what I have found is short, sharp pulse surveys with only 2 or 3 questions in them, rather than these enormous annual events, actually help you make progress and help you map it.
Thank you very much. Now we have an anonymous question, which reads as follows. The courage to get out of your comfort zone requires a willingness to make mistakes with a hope that mistakes will be forgiven.
Yep.
Today, the definition of mistakes is widening. Given that the expression of honestly held lawful views can cost you your job, is it a realistic ask of people to stick their necks out, I guess our questioner is asking?
That's why I raised it. It's the single biggest barrier, in my opinion, at the moment, the inability to express a view and possibly the inability to ask a question without being held to be in contempt in some way. I agree with the questioner. That's why I think safety in numbers. We absolutely need to group together to ask these questions rather than being lone voices in the wilderness. But the fear is exactly that. This is one of the reasons I've been so dispirited in the last few months, that actually legitimate comment, legitimate questions have not just been shouted down, but people have lost jobs. and the trouble with this is, it was always the case in the past, in my experience, that when something was very black or white, the answer was obvious. You are either the right side of the line or the wrong side of the line, and behavior that was in the middle is the most hard to predict. Now it would appear that all behavior is subject to the sort of vote, the vote of the listener, which means that, how do I express this? The lowest common denominator dictates where the debate goes. And I think that is very unfortunate, but I agree with the questioner. The only thing I can think of is safety in numbers.
Thank you. And that does come back to the question of whether you have a high trust culture where leaders in an organization encourage people to speak out, to express their views in a respectful way, to listen to other people and to other perspectives, as you were arguing a few moments ago in answer to the previous question, Irene. But it does also mean that perhaps those of us who are a little bit more, let's say, of an older vintage, have to be ready to be open, to be corrected, or to be at least challenged as to how does the way we express ourselves land with a younger generation, or with different with people from different communities and so on. And on the other hand, that it does mean that different communities, younger generation, don't automatically jump to the barricades as soon as they hear something that they think is potentially off or inappropriate. It does require degrees of trust all round, doesn't it, that you can have those conversations?
I think it does. And of course, we always say these things come back to leadership, and they do. They very much come back to leadership. I was struck the other day I was asked for some help by a young Asian woman who had just joined a board as a non-executive director, and it was she would not tell me which board it was, and I would not tell you anyway. But she was saying that during the course of a board meeting, it was quite clear that she was being treated badly. I mean, in a very old-fashioned, bantery sort of way, but she was being treated badly. And nobody stood up for her. And I said to her, you absolutely have to speak to the chairperson, because actually the reality is that is the person who should have been looking after you. And if that fails, then you have to speak to the senior independent director. And if that fails, I'm afraid you probably only have one alternative. This is most unfortunate, but it does come down to leadership and trust.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Donna Lee Bauer. How can we convince leadership of the business imperative, obviously for acting on inclusion? We're listening to this lecture, we're watching this lecture because we're already on board. So you've had loads of experience of this in your long career with HSBC, I'm sure in your time in Virgin Money, and now with Taylor Wimpey and Control Risks. So what advice to Donna?
Well, actually, there is, I didn't go into it. This was more of a sort of a personal view this evening, but there are reams of data which indicate that diverse and inclusive organizations have better productivity, that they have better engagement. Better engagement leads to better results with customers. Employee engagement is key. You're creating value and not destroying it if you have employee engagement. There are numbers coming out of everybody's ears on this subject. Whenever I have been asked on why are you doing this, Irene, which did happen on the way through my career in HSBC, why are you doing this, Irene? Why is it important? Because actually, even if you don't believe in it, even if I can't get through to your heartstrings by saying, would you like your daughter to be treated like this? Even if I can't get to you like that, look at the numbers. So business people are persuaded by numbers, and there is sufficient data out there that shows them that this kind of organization, it produces good pounds and dollars and not bad ones.
I so agree. So for example, business in the community, with their Race for Opportunity campaign and their Opportunity Now campaigns, respectively, on race and gender, have been developing the business case for 30 years or so. The Business Disability Forum has been doing excellent work for as long on the business case for including those of us who are disabled in the workplace fully. And there's a great campaigning organization called Open for Business. Their founder was on one of our earlier webinars on the diversity and inclusion topic. They've been doing a lot of economic case arguments around inclusion for LGBTQ plus communities. So you're right, absolutely right. There is lots of data out there now. And indeed, if you haven't seen it, the Institute of Business Ethics produced in April of last year a report on the ethics of diversity. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Even earlier, December of last year, 2020, we produced a research paper. I think Deborah Gitcham and Mark Chambers, who worked together on that report, The Ethics of Diversity. I think they're both on this webinar. And then in April of this year, we followed up with a board briefing on the kind of things that you need to think about around the boardroom table and how the board needs to take a leadership role in terms of setting the example, setting the tone, so tone from the top in terms of inclusion. Now we have a question from Sally Smith, really interesting one again. And she writes, I firmly believe that until we get rid of labels, and she says, I'm a woman, I'm gay, I'm black, we will never get to real diversity and inclusion. It really shouldn't matter. Do you think we'll ever get there? Sally asks.
Gosh, I wish, I want, and I wish that to be the case, because that is the way that it should be. And it's clear, you know, again, there is data to show that if you manage, when you have a recruitment process going, for example, to eliminate anything that indicates who the person is who is applying, there is a much greater uptake of candidates from ethnic backgrounds, for example, if you can't see the name or you can't see a photograph. So I completely agree, but we love labels. That's the problem. We just love labels, and we've become very, very tribal at the moment. And that's why I'm saying, is this a pivotal moment for the good or for the bad? Are we simply stalling at the moment and going into a little backwater of aggression, or is this a pivotal moment where we really need to push this forward? Because it's completely right. We are in a tribal, fragmented, labeled place at the moment. And that's why the speciality groups emerge. And it's very, very hard to deal with one issue at a time over and over again. So I totally agree. And it is something that we should continue to strive for.
I imagine after your time in the United States, Irene, you still have lots of contacts over there. Many friends and so on, and so you must be picking up a lot of evidence, as I am, from friends and colleagues in the US about the culture wars that are so prevalent there now, with such toxic effect, whether it's on the body politic or whether it's on being able to make really genuine progress around lots of the different dimensions of inclusion. I think there's a real danger that the culture wars could be brought over to this country as well if we are not careful. And it would be unforgivable if that were to happen, given that we've already seen how toxic it is for the United States, for business, for society, and so on. And any thoughts about things that we can particularly do, Irene, to make sure that we minimize the risks of culture wars here?
Well, it's a tough one, because you're right. We're watching it being played out. We're watching what could happen, and it is a very scary thing to see. I actually believe, since we're talking about the corporate world and business particularly, that boards have a very big part to play in this. They have a part to play by holding management to account and taking an interest. I'm the employee champion for Rolls-Royce and a non-executive director. And the whole point about the employee champion is that you're supposed to bring the views of the employee into the boardroom. I've found it invaluable. And I'll tell this simply because it was mentioned in our annual report and accounts 3 years ago. We discovered as part of my visiting that we had, in not everywhere, but in some places, a culture of bullying and harassment. And it was decided that we needed, first of all, to uncover it and go completely clean, honest and transparent about it. The board was totally supportive. The CEO was totally supportive, and now there is an active campaign throughout the organisation demonstrating what the behaviours are that Rolls-Royce would like to see. Now, that's a very tip of the iceberg compared to a culture war, but the board had a big say in that. The board now speaks, doesn't speak with one voice on everything, obviously, but the board speaks about diversity and inclusion at almost every meeting. I think that boards have a big leadership role to play in the corporate arena. Quite what happens when you go into the political arena, and if this week in the UK is anything to go by, then God help us. Quite what happens in the political arena, I'm not sure to what extent business is in a position to influence our politicians or institutions. And actually, I'd probably throw that question out to you, David, and to the rest of the audience.
Yes, indeed. I'm going to go back though to, rather than, I'm going to duck that particular invitation directly, and I'm going to go some more of the questions that are coming in, because we're getting some really interesting, important questions to try and get through. So Malcolm Slee asks, how do we get from fulfilling quotas to show, in inverted commas, diversity, to actually having a fully integrated workforce?
So this quotas thing is a real aggravation, and I didn't mention it because I probably could have gone off at a tangent. I used to think quotas were a bad thing because they lead to tokenism, and I would not want to think that I am the person in the room that was there because of the quota. Having said that, and having been in Malaysia where quotas are prevalent, you have to have this percentage and that percentage, and actually what happens is you clog up the meritocracy and the talent progression and the recruitment. So I used to say they were a bad thing. Then somebody said to me, well, so how do we move the dial quicker then if we don't have quotas? And I have to say, I don't really have an answer to that, but I'm still not a great fan of quotas. I am a great fan of objectives. I am a great fan of publishing objectives, and I am a great fan of explaining, for example, in your annual report and accounts, what objectives you've got. And I am a great fan of investors holding people to account to explain exactly what they are doing, not just the numbers, to actually say, this is what we are doing to close these gaps. Because it isn't a question of just counting how many different people you've got of what sort. This is a question of changing behaviors. So I am a fan of telling the story year by year by year as a progression. And I am a fan of explaining what the pulse surveys are saying, for example. So telling the world what your pulse surveys say, setting the objectives of the CEO and the senior management by reference to the answers to questions in the pulse surveys, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a question of getting under the bonnet of those numbers and getting to the behavioral levers and pulling those levers.
And I suspect you've partly also just answered the question from Will Smith. Will asks, how important is data in driving inclusion? Well, I think you've just said it's absolutely critical. But he's asking about things like pay gap reporting. And also I would maybe extend that to things like disability, employment gap reporting, things of that nature. Would you favor that kind of more granular requirements on business, or would you say that's what good businesses, good, responsible, ethical businesses will do, and we should encourage good practice rather than yet more regulatory requirements in this area?
I think two things. I think we're overloading our companies with very specific regulatory requirements. What happens is they start to be headlines. If you watch what's happening in the climate space, there's quite a few companies who will never make their headlines. There's quite a few governments who will never make their headlines. This is about what goes on underneath. And so I think that if you listen to the investor community, what they are saying is, we expect your annual report and accounts to expand. It's not that we want you to give me very precise analytical details. I want to know how you're closing the gap. I want you to explain your gap. I want you to tell me what steps you're taking to close that gap. What I think that the numbers have done, which I think why I think they're very good, is they've drawn attention to it. They've actually drawn attention to it. And they have made people think about, well, why is it like that? And sometimes it's entirely explainable. It's also inexplicable when certain, for example, some of the partnerships, the law partnerships, will not publish. Immediately you have to think, well, why not? So it's the data is causing us to say, why is that like that? But actually, I think rather than it being layers and layers of regulation and very specific, tick this box, it has to be a comply or explain.
Thank you very much. That's old Derek Higgs principle, very, very important, yes. So Honorary Treasurer and fellow trustee, Mike Tuffrey, again, thanks you for a very, very powerful Hugh Kay Memorial Lecture, but asks, do you have a view on the importance of lived experience? Where do those without it? Well, I guess we all might have our own lived experiences, but who are in a position of authority and have a responsibility to act. Where do they get the confidence and authenticity to be able to talk about these issues?
Well, these are all very behavioural things, aren't they? This is exactly why it's very hard to put your finger on it. We're asking people to change their behaviour. We're asking people to stand up and be counted, and it's a scary thing to do. And therefore, you have to believe that the prize is worth it. You have to believe that and I believe that inclusion, diversity and inclusion, and the ability to have an exchange of views underpins so much else that the prize is worth it. And having gone, as I said, through the ups and downs of the last few months, thinking to myself, maybe I'm just too old. Maybe I should just give up. Maybe I've just got an old-fashioned voice in this and I don't understand. But actually, I've come back full circle and said, no, this is not right. This is something that we need all to fight for. Where do you find the lived experience? Well, people should show their hand more. They should be more vulnerable and more open about what's happened to them as people. This is all about people. Business is only about people. If you can't show your hand, if you can't be vulnerable, if you can't say sorry, if you can't make a mistake, if you can't do any of those things, then I suspect that half the battle is lost. And, whenever you get interviewed, the people give you those sheets about, does this person know about the P&L? Does this person know about, there's always a bit in there for leadership. So how does this person deal with ambiguity? Well, all leaders are supposed to be able to deal with ambiguity. But just at the moment, apparently ambiguity isn't allowed. So I think this is going to be about bravery over the next year.
And this is talking about some very different leadership attributes, isn't it? If we're asking leaders, particularly leaders at a later stage in their careers, to open themselves up, to be, in your words, Irene, to show your vulnerabilities, this is going to require a different approach. And do you see from the different experiences that you've had in boardrooms and senior management in different parts of the world during your career, do you see that there are more leaders now coming through who are able to show that kind of empathy and caring for the other, who are able to admit their own blind spots and to admit some of their own vulnerabilities?
I think there's now a mix. I think if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, the answer would have been a no. But I think there is now a mix. I think somebody was saying to me just the other day that they believed, and it's hard for me to comment, but they believed that the style of chairs of boards coming through now is worlds different from the old-fashioned chairs that we used to see before. And I tell you, there's an argument that says that's because we've got more diversity on boards.
Very interesting. And I guess there's probably a really good piece of research to be done by someone, maybe someone watching the 2021 IBE Hugh Kay Memorial Lecture. For example, to take some of the shortlisted candidates for the Sunday Times NEDs of the year and so on, and just to have a look and see whether some of these more kind of caring and empathetic characteristics are being emphasized more in the kind of profiles and the kind of people who are being given the awards from some of these external award ceremonies. Now, we have another anonymous question. How do we get social mobility on the agenda when protected characteristics, at least certainly here in the UK, under UK equality legislation, dominate our thinking on inclusion?
Goodness, these are difficult questions this evening, and I guess that's what the Institute is all about. So how do we get social mobility? There is, well, of course, we could end up talking about levelling up, but there is a role in here for business to play. And I think that, for example, there are investments that corporates can make in the areas, in the communities and in the geographies where they operate, where they can actually assist in this. But the difficulty with having this conversation with somebody who's from the corporate world is most of the corporations will say to you that in terms of social mobility, this needs much greater thinking from not just the business world, but from the educational establishments and from the government itself and from local regional government. And I think that the way that people are thinking about social mobility and about levelling up now is there is not one size that fits all, and there's not one rule that you can dictate from the centre, from government, that is actually going to be to do with regional efforts. It's going to be to do with whatever suits the region that you're talking about. And that's quite hard to get at. So I suspect there should be a number of efforts in a number of different regions, which include that they're all party working groups, if you like. That's a bit of a bad word to use today, I'm aware, because of the press, but you know, that it includes business, it includes the education system, and it includes the local government as well. I can't think of any other way of doing it except by collaboration.
And I think any business or any business person that wants to try and help to address these challenges of social mobility, one of the best things that they can do is sign up for one of the programs that mentor school children,
yep,
secondary school students and so on, get involved in helping with live curriculum lessons that are relevant in terms of real world business experience and so on, talking about their own career progression and so on in careers fairs and all of those kind of good things. Certainly, I know the experience over many years of our sister organization, Business in the Community, with the education business partnerships and things like head teacher and business leader two-way mentoring, all very practical programs to improve the quality of the experience in schools. And of course, one of the really great programs is Teach First, which yep, has been running now for many years. Now, we have a question from a Marek Podsiadly. I apologize if I've not quite got the pronunciation right, but Marek asks, to what extent do you think that the barriers to greater, more inclusive corporate cultures are the results of malignant or ignorant intentions? So I guess Marek is wanting to know Is it because organizations don't quite know how to do it, rather than that they don't want to do it, or they don't think they should do it?
So I'll deal with the corporate question first. They don't know how. And I fall back on my premise that all corporations are actually just a collection of people. So they don't know how. So they need to find people within their organizations or recruit people into their organizations who are prepared to educate them in the how. So I don't believe that corporates themselves are malignant. Sadly, I think that we have misled ourselves into thinking that society and that individuals are all benign, and actually I'm not convinced now that they are. And that was back to my first point, that I suspect that the sort of cosmopolitan elite, whatever you want to call it, the liberal elite that started to think about this in the 60s, did not bother to think about whether this was happening and whether everybody was coming with them, or whether in fact we just were headlining again, and that actually underneath things were not as good as we thought they were. So it's a terrible answer to the question, really, because I don't think corporations are malignant, quite the reverse. I think, or malign rather, I think that they just don't know. And they can be jogged out of their ignorance by the right employees or by the right leadership. But I fear that if we think that, given the activity that goes on social media and the comments that people are prepared to make on social media, not just in the UK, but worldwide, I think we are kidding ourselves if we think that we are all on the same page on this issue.
Indeed, and perhaps the practical things that companies that don't feel confident about how to approach inclusion, the kind of practical things they can do. Well, first off, our April 2021 board briefing about 10 key action points that boards can start with, maybe one starting point, and looking at some of the detailed how-to guidance from some of the business-led campaigns around different dimensions of inclusion that we mentioned earlier. Now we're getting some great questions from our live audience today. So Irene, I'm going to put you through to another really tough one. This time it's from a David Hosnelli, and David says there are certain individuals who cannot compete in the so-called meritocratic recruitment drives because of a lifetime of adverse circumstances. So I guess we're back to some of these questions of multi-generational lack of social mobility and so on. And David says these adverse circumstances, which impact on people's ability to compete in the job market in the traditional manner. So he asks, is it the responsibility of organizations, excuse me, to offer additional programs, such as investing in individuals to develop the necessary leadership skills, which would ultimately make them be able to compete and create a more genuinely diverse workforce?
So I'm not in the business of trying to say that the business world, that corporates can solve all of the social issues which governments are failing, possibly by lack of investment, to actually solve. But I do think that there is going to have to be some kind of cooperation between businesses, otherwise, and government and other institutions. Otherwise, and you have to choose your way you're going to actually invest, because you can't invest everywhere. And it has to be in line with your commercial imperative. So you would not think, for example, of trying to create an apprenticeship scheme if you didn't have any roles for apprentices in your organization. So it has to be something that suits your corporate mission and your purpose. And it does somewhat come down to your purpose and values for a corporation. But I actually am a believer in corporates investing locally, usually in partnership. So perhaps with a community foundation, or as you pointed out, some of the organizations, David, who can take part. I am a believer. I don't think that it is totally the responsibility of the corporate. But if corporates do not then actually the pool of talent and employees is not going to be sufficiently diverse, and actually we are going to continue to discount a large proportion of the workforce from actually moving forward. So yes, I think we have a responsibility. No, it is not totally a corporate responsibility, but we are a partner.
I so agree. And I do think that the current so-called intensification of the war for talent does create an opportunity for organizations, for very bottom line, self-interested reasons, to be thinking more expansively about where do we recruit from, how do we make ourselves as attractive to as wide a range of candidates as possible, so that we're not missing out on some really interesting and good potential candidates. Now, if you look at things like the way that Timson's, the family business, who've been such strong exponents of the idea of employing ex-offenders and giving people a second chance. I think something like 10% of their workforce today are ex-offenders, and the way in which more than a million jobs have been opened up to people who do have previous convictions through the Ban the Box campaign. There are some of the practical things that people can do.
David, it's also, sorry, David, I was going to say, it's also true, and this is not an easy thing at all, because you're asking for change of behaviour again, because in fact, even talking to the sort of people that the question is raising, it's a different vocabulary, it's a different way of speaking, and corporates don't understand, business people do not speak that language. We're going to have to be far more tolerant and understand better how other people express themselves.
Indeed. Now we are coming almost to the end of this year's Hugh Kay Lecture. We've still got lots of questions coming in, but we've got a question from one of my predecessors as the chair of the Institute of Business Ethics, Chris Morehouse. And Chris, and in a sense, it's going back to one of the earlier questions, but Chris asks, how do we encourage leaders to explore the origins of their own personal unconscious biases? He actually elaborates that for him, it wasn't until he was moved to confront the biases of his own family and the small white community that he came from, that he was able to see some of his own unconscious biases and to make progress. So are there any kind of clever techniques or tips that you've seen over the years, Irene, where you've seen senior business figures who perhaps have been encouraged and able to confront some of their own unconscious biases?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. As I said in my remarks, I was probably 50 before I realised that here was I looked around the room and thought, well, I'm still the only one here, so what on earth has gone wrong? And the answer was partly my fault. I had not actually understood that it required a degree of advocacy and effort from me to put my shoulder to the wheel to actually and get rid of some of the stuff that the baggage that I'd acquired along the way. I think two things, really. I think it's a great question. I think it is to do with coaching. The biggest assistance I have had in confronting my own sort of ghosts and so on is through a coach, a critical friend, who can actually say to you, well, why do you think that? Why? And to actually point you in the right direction. And the other thing, the aha moment for me, is reverse mentoring. I've done it twice. And on both occasions, I have come out of it thinking, I just didn't know that was how the world worked. And I've heard that said so many times about reverse mentoring, not just in terms of youth to age, but in terms of, black to white, in terms of, ethnic minorities, disabled, whatever. It is actually a real eye-opener. And all of your preconceived ideas of why the world was the way it was, they sort of fly out the window.
there is no substitute for being able to walk in the other person's shoes and be able to see things from a different person's perspective. And that, I think, leads very nicely to what will be our last question this evening. Again, from somebody who wants to remain anonymous. And it's quite a personal one, actually. Do you have any suggestions for how to expand your own social circle? The questioner adds, I think many people are conscious of the fact that they have their comfort zone, they operate within their comfort zone, and want to mix with people that are different to themselves, but are not quite sure how to go about this. Any things that you've seen over the years that has worked, perhaps in the businesses that you've been associated with, Irene?
You know, it has actually happened to me mainly through business, because socially it is exceptionally difficult to do. And so because you meet just by force of circumstance, a whole variation of people in the business world, it is easier to make that approach, to ask if you can have coffee. I was massively flattered, actually. I was speaking at a university event, and I was approached afterwards by a young woman who was Nigerian background, and she asked if I would speak with a small group of women that she was involved with. They were helping each other because they could not find people to help them. And so they clubbed together from different professions. And it turned out, I turned up in the room, and there are 5 of them, absolutely fantastic women, and they're all Nigerian. And I have to tell you, I learned more from them, I think, than they learned from me. But that opportunity would never have arisen except through a business context, because where would I have met that woman socially? I would not. And so my experience of this is I have widened my contacts mainly through business contact. And just take the opportunity to say, will you have a coffee with me? You know, can I talk to you about this?
And I know one top city financier who makes a point of trying to meet a young entrepreneur every working day, just to get that very different generational perspective. So thinking about how we can utilize some of our existing opportunities. I'm a huge fan of the Forward Institute, which is just now launching its 7th cohort of people. They bring future leaders together from the public sector, from charities and NGOs, the third sector, and then from business. And they deliberately mix them up in a very, very intense series of leadership experiences over the course of 18 months. And of course, there's the very well-established Common Purpose program over many years. But I guess another way is by going and volunteering, where you're going to be mixing with some very different people again, and deliberately looking for a kind of volunteering opportunity which will force you to get outside some of the comfort zones. I mean, any final thoughts before we wrap up this year's Hugh Kay Memorial Lecture?
Well, only to say thank you very much, and to say, David, that I'd be grateful for the opportunity, even though I found it a bit scary, and I found all those questions quite unsettling, which I think is the whole point. And I think that has probably proven that surely, at least in this place, we can have some kind of tolerant debate to try to move ourselves forward. So thank you very much indeed.
Irene, thank you enormously for giving up your time, giving us such food for thought. We're enormously grateful. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have enjoyed this Institute of Business Ethics event, then please do sign up for our free weekly newsletter, which carries details of forthcoming webinars and training opportunities, and also gives details of all of our new publications as they come out, and also for our latest blogs on our website, ibe.org.uk, where you can keep up to date with what the Institute is doing. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And once again, a huge thank you on behalf of the IBE to Irene Dorner for this superb lecture and for answering so honestly some really tough questions. I'm glad that I was simply being the questioner and not having to answer them myself. So Irene, thank you and good night.